The dust hung in the air like a veil of grief when Ethan Pierce rode into Silver Peak, Nevada on a scorching afternoon in July of 1878. His horse barely able to take another step after 3 days of hard riding from Sacramento. And he had not come looking for trouble or salvation, but only a place to rest his weary bones for a night, before continuing on to nowhere in particular. The town was smaller than he expected, just a collection of weathered buildings clustered along a single dirt road with the mountains rising stark and beautiful behind them. And as he led his horse toward what looked like a stable, a woman came running out of a small house at the edge of town, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, and her face streaked with tears that cut clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. She did not see him at first, too consumed by whatever private agony drove her steps, but when she stumbled and caught herself against a fence post, their eyes met for just a moment. Hers were the color of amber, lit from within by some fierce and desperate light, and in that instant, Ethan felt something shift in his chest like a key turning in a lock he had not known existed. Then she was gone, disappearing into the general store with the bell above the door clanging harsh and final. Ethan stood there longer than he should have, staring at the place where she had been, before he shook himself and continued on to the stable. The man who ran it was an old Mexican named Carlos who took one look at Ethan's exhausted mount and clucked his tongue sympathetically. "You ride hard, senor," Carlos said, already moving to remove the saddle. "This horse needs rest. You need rest too, I think." "Just passing through," Ethan replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Figured I would stay the night, maybe too. We have a boarding house. Mrs. Chen, she keeps clean rooms and serves good food, down that way, the building with the blue door." Carlos gestured vaguely toward the center of town, then paused, his weathered face growing serious. "You see anyone running just now? A woman maybe?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Dark hair. Looked upset." Carlos sighed deeply, and in that sigh Ethan heard a world of sorrow. "That is Miss Margaret Jensen. Terrible thing, terrible. Her sister died 4 days ago, childbirth, and now Margaret has 3 little ones to care for and no husband of her own to help. The father, he was a prospector, died in a mining accident 6 months back. Those children, they have nobody but their aunt now, and Margaret, she is barely making it herself." Something cold settled in Ethan's stomach. He thought of his own childhood, the years after his mother passed and his father took to drink, the hunger and the fear and the awful uncertainty of each new day. "She got any help? Anyone in town lending a hand? People try, but everyone has their own troubles. This is a hard place, senor. Silver Peak does not give anything easy." Carlos patted the horse's neck gently. "Your horse will be ready tomorrow afternoon. You pay when you collect him." Ethan paid for the night's boarding and took his saddlebags over his shoulder. But instead of heading toward the boarding house, he found himself walking back toward that small house at the edge of town. He told himself he just wanted to see if the woman needed anything. A few dollars maybe, or some help with heavy lifting, the kind of thing any decent person would offer. But the truth, if he had been honest enough to admit it, was that he could not get her face out of his mind, the grief and determination mixed together in those amber eyes. The house was tiny, barely more than a cabin, with a sagging porch and windows that needed washing. As he approached, he could hear crying from inside, a child's wail of misery that went on and on without pause. Ethan knocked on the doorframe, since there was no proper door, just a blanket hung across the opening to keep out the worst of the dust. The crying stopped abruptly. There was a long moment of silence. Then the blanket twitched aside and Margaret Jensen stood there. And up close, she was even more striking than she had been from a distance. She could not have been more than 23 or 24, with fine features and a straight back, despite the exhaustion that darkened the skin beneath her eyes. She wore a simple dress that had been mended many times, and her hands, he noticed, were raw and red from hard work. Yes. Her voice was hoarse, probably from crying, but she held her chin high. "Madam, my name is Ethan Pierce. I just rode into town and I heard about your loss. I am real sorry." The words felt inadequate, but he pressed on. "I was wondering if you might need any help. Chopping wood, fixing anything that needs fixing, whatever you need." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he was genuine or simply another man looking for something he had no right to ask for. Finally, she said, "I do not have money to pay you. I am not asking for money." Then what are you asking for? It was a fair question, and Ethan found he did not have a good answer. "Nothing, madam. I just thought you could use a hand." Behind her, the crying started up again, joined now by a second voice and then a third. Margaret's face crumpled for just a second before she mastered herself, and when she spoke again her voice was tight with the effort of staying calm. "The children need to eat. I was just trying to figure out what to make, but the little one, Sarah, she will not stop crying and I cannot think straight." "I could watch them while you cook," Ethan offered, surprising himself. "Or I could cook while you tend to them. I am not much of a cook, but I can manage beans and bacon." Margaret studied him again, and he saw the moment she made her decision, saw her shoulders drop just slightly as she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in, then, and thank you." The interior of the house was dim and close, the air heavy with the smell of sickness and unwashed bodies. There was one main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a curtain strung across one corner to partition off what must be a sleeping area. In the middle of the floor sat two children, both girls, one perhaps 5 years old and the other maybe 7. They stared at Ethan with huge, frightened eyes. In Margaret's arms, a baby who could not have been more than a few months old screamed with the single-minded intensity of the very young. "This is Emma," Margaret said, nodding toward the older girl, "and that is Lucy. The baby is Sarah. Girls, this is Mr. Pierce. He is going to help us for a little while." Emma's lip trembled. "I want Mama." "I know, sweetheart, I know." Margaret's voice broke, and she turned away quickly, jiggling the baby in a futile attempt to quiet her. "There is cornmeal in the bin and some salt pork in the cold box. We have eggs, too, from the chickens out back." Ethan set his saddlebags down carefully and moved toward the small stove in the corner, trying not to think about how this was not his problem, how he had been planning to just pass through town and keep moving like he always did. But when he glanced back and saw Margaret swaying on her feet, the baby still screaming, and the two little girls clinging to each other on the floor, he knew he could not walk away. Not yet. He built up the fire in the stove and found the supplies Margaret had mentioned. As he worked, cracking eggs into a bowl and slicing the salt pork, he listened to Margaret singing softly to the baby, some lullaby he half remembered from his own childhood. Gradually, Sarah's cries subsided to hiccups and then to silence. When Ethan looked over, he saw that Margaret had sat down in the single rocking chair, the baby finally asleep against her shoulder, and her own eyes were closed. "Miss Jensen," he said quietly. She jerked awake, her eyes wild for a moment before she remembered where she was. "I am sorry. I have not slept since." She stopped, swallowing hard. "Since it happened. When did you last eat?" She blinked at him as if he had asked her something in a foreign language. "I do not remember." Ethan turned back to the stove, his jaw tight. He finished making scrambled eggs with bits of salt pork mixed in, then found a loaf of bread that was starting to go stale and cut thick slices. It was not much, but it was hot and filling. He set plates on the rickety table and gestured to the girls. "Come on now. Time to eat." Emma and Lucy looked at Margaret, who nodded wearily. They climbed onto the chairs, and Ethan was struck by how thin they were, how their dresses hung loose on their small frames. He served them generous portions and then fixed a plate for Margaret, who was still sitting in the rocking chair with the sleeping baby. "I cannot leave her," Margaret protested when he brought the plate over. "She will wake up." "Then you eat right there, but you need to eat, Miss Jensen." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something that might have been gratitude or might have been the beginning of tears. "You can call me Margaret. Margaret then, and I am Ethan." She nodded and began to eat, slowly at first and then with increasing hunger, and Ethan felt an odd sense of satisfaction watching her. He fixed himself a plate and sat down at the table with the girls, who were shoveling food into their mouths like they had not eaten in days. Maybe they had not. "Do you have a horse?" Emma asked suddenly, fixing him with a direct stare that reminded him eerily of Margaret. "I do. His name is Rusty on account of his color." "Can we see him?" "Emma, do not pester Mr. Pierce," Margaret said from the rocking chair. "I do not mind." "Maybe tomorrow, after Rusty has rested up some. He had a long journey." Ethan took a bite of eggs, chewing thoughtfully. "You girls like horses." "Papa used to let me pet the horses when he went to work," Emma said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "before he died." Lucy, the younger one, started to cry then, silent tears rolling down her cheeks, and Emma put an arm around her sister with a fierceness that broke something in Ethan's chest. These children had lost everything, and they were so damned small, so fragile in the face of a world that did not care about their pain. He looked across the room and met Margaret's eyes, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. She was drowning, and she knew it, and she had just been waiting for the waters to close over her head. But now, for reasons neither of them fully understood, Ethan was here, and he was not going anywhere. After the meal, Ethan helped Emma and Lucy wash their faces and hands in a basin of water, while Margaret tried to get the baby down in what must have been a makeshift cradle, just a drawer pulled from a dresser and lined with blankets. When Sarah was finally settled, Margaret turned to find Ethan rolling up his sleeves. "What needs doing around here?" he asked. "Ethan, you have already done so much. What needs doing?" he repeated, more firmly this time. Margaret pressed her lips together, and he could see her pride warring with her desperation. Desperation 1. The roof leaks in the back corner when it rains. The chicken coop needs repairing or the coyotes will get in. The water pump is stiff and I can barely work it. The garden is full of weeds. The front step is coming loose. Her voice broke. "I cannot do it all. I have tried, but I cannot." "Then I will help you." "Why?" The word came out sharp, almost accusatory. "You do not know me. You do not know these children. Why would you help us?" Ethan considered this, looking at the two little girls who were watching him with those wide, wary eyes. "Because somebody should," he said finally. "And I am here." It was not the whole truth, but it was all he could give her in that moment. The whole truth was more complicated, tangled up with his own past, and the way her face had looked in the sunlight and the feeling that had come over him when he saw her stumble, like recognizing something he had been looking for without knowing he was searching. Margaret studied him for a long time, and he saw the exact moment she made her decision, saw the tension leave her shoulders as she finally let herself accept help. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon working on the chicken coop, which was in even worse shape than Margaret had indicated. Half the wire was torn away, and several boards had rotted through completely. He made a list in his head of supplies he would need and resolved to visit the general store in the morning. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, he became aware that he was being watched. Emma and Lucy had crept out of the house and were standing a careful distance away, observing his work with solemn interest. "You girls want to help?" he asked. They exchanged glances, some silent conversation passing between them, and then Emma nodded. Ethan set them to gathering up the scraps of wood and wire he had removed, making a pile away from the coop, and they worked with a quiet intensity that made his heart ache. They were trying so hard to be good, to not be a burden, and they were so young they should not have to worry about such things. When the light grew too dim to work by, Ethan walked back to the house with the girls trailing behind him like small shadows. Margaret was at the stove again, stirring something in a pot, and the baby was awake in the cradle, making the small grunting sounds that infants make. "I should go find that boarding house," Ethan said, though he found himself reluctant to leave. "I will come back in the morning if that is all right." Margaret turned to face him, and in the lamplight her face looked softer, younger. "You could stay for supper. It is just stew, but there is enough. I would not want to impose. You have been working all afternoon." "It is the least I can do." She hesitated, then added, "Please. It has been nice having another adult to talk to, even if we have not talked much." So Ethan stayed, eating watery stew that Margaret apologized for 3 times and he insisted was fine. The girls were more animated now, chattering about the chickens and asking him questions about his horse and where he had come from. He told them about Sacramento and the jobs he had worked there, about the ranch where he had learned to rope cattle, about the time he had seen a bear up in the mountains. He left out the harder parts, the fights and the close calls and the long stretches of loneliness. When it was time for the girls to sleep, Margaret herded them behind the curtain, and Ethan heard her murmuring to them, heard their sleepy protests and then silence. She emerged a few minutes later, looking more exhausted than ever. They go down easy at least. Small mercies. She sank into the rocking chair and picked up the baby, who had started to fuss. "I should feed her. I will step outside." "Thank you." Ethan went out onto the porch and sat down on the edge, letting his legs dangle over the side where the step was loose. The night was cooler now, the desert giving up the day's heat rapidly, and overhead the stars were beginning to emerge, more stars than he had ever seen in the city. He could hear Margaret singing inside, that same lullaby, and the sound made something in his chest feel tight and full at once. He had not planned on this. He had been drifting for 2 years now, ever since his father drank himself to death and left Ethan alone at 24 with nothing but a horse and a saddle and an aching need to be anywhere but where he was. He had worked as a ranch hand, a freight guard, a carpenter's assistant, taking jobs that lasted weeks or months before moving on. He told himself he liked the freedom, the lack of ties, but the truth was he had been running from the fear that if he stayed anywhere too long, he would turn into his father, bitter and broken and drowning in bottle after bottle of whiskey. But sitting here on this sagging porch, listening to a woman sing to a baby who was not hers, Ethan felt something shift inside him. A sense of purpose, maybe, or just a reason to stop running. The door opened behind him and Margaret stepped out, the baby asleep against her shoulder again. She sat down beside him, careful not to jostle Sarah, and for a long moment they simply sat there in comfortable silence. "Tell me about your sister," Ethan said finally. Margaret drew in a shaky breath. "Her name was Rebecca. She was 3 years younger than me, and she was the sweetest person I have ever known. When James, her husband, died in that mine collapse, I thought it would destroy her. But she held on for the girls, and when she found out she was expecting again, she was so happy. She said it was a gift from James, one last piece of him to love." Her voice wavered. "The birth was hard. Too hard. The doctor said there was nothing he could do, that she had just lost too much blood. She held Sarah once, told me to take care of her babies, and then she was gone. I am so sorry, Margaret. They are all I have left of her. Emma has her eyes, and Lucy has her smile, and Sarah I barely know yet, but she is part of Rebecca too. I have to keep them safe. I have to give them a good life, but I do not know how. The last words came out as barely more than a whisper. I work as a seamstress, but it does not pay much, and now with the baby I cannot work as much. The rent on this house is due in 2 weeks and I do not have it. I keep thinking something will work out, that God will provide, but what if He does not? What if I lose them? You will not lose them. Ethan said it with more certainty than he felt. You cannot know that. No, but I can help make sure of it. Margaret turned to look at him, her amber eyes searching his face in the starlight. Why are you doing this? And do not say because somebody should. I want the real reason. Ethan was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. My ma died when I was 8, he said slowly. And my pa, he fell apart, started drinking, could not hold a job, and I spent the next 10 years just trying to keep us fed and keep him out of trouble. When he finally died, I felt relief more than grief, and I hated myself for it. I swore I would never let myself get tied down to anything or anyone, that I would just keep moving and never have to feel that kind of helpless again. He paused, staring out at the dark shapes of the mountains. But when I saw you today, when I heard about those kids, I just knew I could not walk away. Maybe it is selfish, maybe I am trying to make up for all the times nobody helped us. I do not know. All I know is I am here, and I am not leaving until you and those girls are going to be all right. Margaret was silent for so long that Ethan thought maybe he had said too much, revealed too much of his own damaged places. But then she reached over and took his hand, her small rough fingers curling around his calloused ones, and the simple touch sent a shock through his entire body. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for staying." They sat there like that, hands joined, until Sarah stirred and Margaret had to take her inside. Ethan walked back to the boarding house in a daze, barely aware of his surroundings, the feeling of Margaret's hand in his still burning against his palm. Mrs. Chen, the proprietor of the boarding house, was a tiny Chinese woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She showed him to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor and informed him that breakfast was at 6, and there would be no refunds if he missed it. Ethan thanked her and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, asleep almost before his head hit the pillow. He dreamed of amber eyes and a sagging porch and 3 small faces watching him with desperate hope. The next morning, Ethan was up before dawn. He ate the breakfast Mrs. Chen served, which consisted of rice porridge and some kind of pickled vegetables that he found surprisingly good, and then headed to the general store as soon as it opened. The proprietor was a balding man named Walter who eyed Ethan with undisguised curiosity as he listed out what he needed: chicken wire, nails, lumber, tar paper for the roof, lamp oil, coffee, flour, sugar, beans, dried meat, and a half-dozen other staples. "That is going to cost you," Walter said, tallying up the numbers. "I know. Can you deliver it to the Jensen place?" Walter's eyebrows shot up. "You staying out there, just helping out for a bit?" "Uh-huh." Walter looked like he wanted to say more but thought better of it. "I will have one of my boys bring it around this afternoon. You paying cash or credit?" "Cash." Ethan counted out the money, watching his carefully saved wages dwindle significantly. But he thought of Emma and Lucy's thin faces and did not regret it. When he arrived at the Jensen house, he found Margaret already up, looking only slightly less exhausted than she had the night before. She had the girls outside, and they were picking vegetables from the weedy garden while Sarah dozed in a basket nearby. "You came back," Emma said when she saw him, and there was such relief in her voice that it made Ethan's throat tighten. "I told you I would. I have supplies coming later today. Thought I would start on that roof." Margaret straightened up, pushing a strand of hair out of her face. "Ethan, you bought supplies. You cannot keep spending your money on us. Already did. Now you have a ladder around here," she did, a rickety thing that looked like it might collapse under his weight, but it held. Ethan spent the morning on the roof, peeling away the old tar paper that had degraded into uselessness and examining the boards underneath. A couple of them were rotted and would need replacing, but most were sound enough. It was hot work under the July sun, sweat running down his back and making his shirt stick to his skin, but it felt good to be doing something useful, something concrete. Below him, he could hear Margaret working in the garden, talking to the girls in a voice that was patient despite her obvious exhaustion. Once, he heard her laugh at something Lucy said, and the sound was so unexpected and so lovely that he stopped hammering for a moment just to listen. The supplies arrived mid-afternoon and Ethan climbed down to help unload them. Margaret came over, wiping her hands on her apron, and stared at the pile of goods with wide eyes. "This is too much," she said. "Ethan, this must have cost a fortune." "It was not that much, and you need it." "I cannot pay you back. I am not asking you to." He picked up a roll of chicken wire. "I am going to finish the coop next, if that is all right." Margaret opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. She reached out and touched his arm just briefly, and he felt that same electric shock as the night before. "You are a good man, Ethan Pierce." He did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and carried the wire toward the coop. Behind him, he heard Margaret directing the delivery boy to bring the food supplies into the house, her voice brisk and practical. Over the next few days, Ethan fell into a routine. He would wake early at the boarding house, eat breakfast, and then walk out to the Jensen place. He worked on repairs during the day while Margaret tended to the house, and the children and her sewing work. In the evenings, they would eat together, simple meals that somehow tasted better than anything Ethan had eaten in years, and afterward, he would play with the girls or hold the baby while Margaret cleaned up. Then, when the children were in bed, he and Margaret would sit on the porch and talk. He learned that she was 23, that she had grown up in Virginia but come west with Rebecca and James after the war, looking for a fresh start. She had nearly married once, back in Virginia, but her fiancé had been killed at Gettysburg, and she had never had the heart to try again. She loved to read but rarely had time for it anymore. She could sew anything, from a simple shirt to an elaborate wedding dress, and she dreamed of someday having her own dress shop. She learned that he was 26, that he had been born in Missouri but had spent most of his life in California. He could rope a steer in under 10 seconds, though he had not done it in nearly a year. He played the harmonica, though not well. He had tried to join the army during the war but been turned away for being too young, a fact that had humiliated him at the time but probably saved his life. He had no family left, no ties to anywhere or anyone. "Until now," Margaret said softly one night, and Ethan felt his heart stutter in his chest. "Until now," he agreed. It was on the 8th night, sitting on that sagging porch under a canopy of stars, that Margaret turned to him and said, "You should know I am falling in love with you." Ethan went very still. Inside the house, he could hear Emma murmuring in her sleep, could hear the creak of the rocking chair where Lucy had fallen asleep. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough, "I know it is fast, I know it is probably foolish. But I am so tired of pretending I do not feel it." She looked at him, and in the moonlight her eyes were luminous. "You have given us everything in the past week. Your time, your money, your kindness. You have made my nieces smile again. You fixed my house and filled my pantry, and you ask for nothing in return. How could I not fall in love with you?" "I am nobody," Ethan said. "I am a drifter with no prospects and no future. You are the man who walked into my house and saw 3 motherless children and sat down and did not get up." Margaret reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "You are the man who stayed." Ethan looked down at their joined hands, at the way hers fit perfectly against his, and felt something crack open inside his chest. All his life he had been running, telling himself he was better off alone, that caring for people only led to pain. But here was Margaret, brave and beautiful, and offering him everything he had been too afraid to want. "I am falling in love with you too," he said, and the words felt like a vow. "I think I started the moment I saw you." Margaret smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face, and Ethan could not help himself. He leaned in and kissed her, gentle and sweet, tasting the salt of dried tears and the hope of new beginnings. She kissed him back, her free hand coming up to cup his face, and for a long, perfect moment, nothing else existed but the two of them and the feeling of coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing hard, Margaret rested her forehead against his. "What do we do now?" she whispered. "I stay," Ethan said simply. "I get a job here in Silver Peak. I help you raise those girls. I court you proper the way you deserve. And when enough time has passed that people will not talk too much, I marry you if you will have me." "Yes," Margaret said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, yes." They sat there in the darkness, holding each other, and Ethan felt a peace settle over him that he had not experienced since before his mother died. He was done running. He had found his place, found his purpose, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure Margaret and those 3 little girls never had to worry or go hungry or feel alone again. The next morning, Ethan went into town properly, no longer just a drifter passing through but a man with a reason to stay. He visited the saloon, which doubled as a meeting hall, and learned that the mine up in the hills was hiring. The pay was decent and the work was hard, but it was steady, and that was what mattered. He signed on to start the following Monday. He also visited the office of the local magistrate, a stern-faced man named Judge Patterson, who listened carefully as Ethan explained the situation at the Jensen house. "You wanting to marry her?" Patterson asked bluntly. "I am, but we need time for propriety's sake. In the meantime, she needs help with those children. I was hoping there might be some kind of support available, maybe from the territorial government or a church fund." Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with shrewd eyes. "There is a widows' and orphans' fund that might apply since the children lost both parents. I will look into it. You seem like a decent sort, Mr. Pierce. We need more men like you in Silver Peak." "Thank you, sir. One more thing. You hurt that girl or those children and you will answer to me." "Understood, understood." When Ethan returned to the Jensen house with the news, Margaret actually cried, clutching his shirt front and shaking with relief. "We are going to be all right," she kept saying. "We are actually going to be all right." "We are," Ethan agreed, holding her tight. "I promise you, we are." The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Ethan had ever known. He started work at the mine, descending into the cool darkness each morning and emerging each evening tired and dirty but satisfied. The work was dangerous, he knew, remembering what had happened to James, but he was careful and he was lucky, and he sent up prayers of thanks for both every night. He moved out of the boarding house and into a small room above the stable, which cost less and was closer to Margaret's place. Every evening, He would wash up at the pump behind the stable and then walk out to see Margaret and the girls. Gradually, Emma and Lucy stopped looking at him like he might disappear at any moment and started treating him like he belonged. Emma began asking him to read her bedtime stories, her small body tucked trustingly against his side. Lucy would climb into his lap at supper and chatter about her day. Even baby Sarah seemed to recognize him, giving him gummy smiles when he picked her up. Margaret bloomed under the relief of not having to carry every burden alone. She took on more sewing work now that she did not have to also worry about repairs and firewood and whether there would be food on the table. She laughed more, sang more, and the haunted look gradually faded from her eyes. They were careful about propriety, never giving the town gossips anything to work with. Ethan always left before full dark, never stayed overnight, never did more than kiss Margaret chastely when the children were asleep. But the connection between them deepened with every passing day, every shared meal, every moment of watching the sunset together while the girls played in the yard. One evening in late August, nearly 2 months after Ethan had first ridden into Silver Peak, Emma approached him with unusual solemnity. She waited until Lucy was distracted helping Margaret with the dishes, then tugged on his sleeve. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Of course, sweetheart. Are you going to be our papa now?" Ethan felt his heart clench. He knelt down so he was at eye level with the little girl. "Would you like me to be?" Emma nodded vigorously. "Lucy and me, we talked about it. We miss Papa and we miss Mama, but we like you. You are nice to us and you make Aunt Margaret smile. We think you would be a good papa." "What about Sarah? Did you ask her opinion?" Ethan said it lightly, trying to keep the sudden swell of emotion out of his voice. Emma giggled. "She is a baby. She does not have opinions yet. But we will tell her about Mama when she is bigger, so she knows." "That is a good plan." Ethan pulled Emma into a hug, burying his face in her hair for a moment. "I would be honored to be your papa, Emma, and Lucy's and Sarah's. But you know I could never replace your real papa, right? He will always be your father, and it is good to remember him." "I know, but you can be our papa too. People can have more than one papa in their whole life, right?" "Right," Ethan said, his voice thick. "They can." That night, after the girls were in bed, Ethan told Margaret about the conversation. She listened with tears streaming down her face, and when he was done she threw her arms around his neck and held on like she would never let go. "They love you," she said. "My girls love you. And I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I love you too, all of you." Ethan pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Margaret, I know it has only been 2 months, but I am surer of this than I have ever been of anything. Will you marry me? Properly, officially, be my wife and let me be a father to those girls?" "Yes," Margaret said, just like she had that first night when he asked. "Yes, Ethan, nothing would make me happier." They decided to wait until October for the wedding, to give the town a bit more time to adjust to the idea and to let Margaret properly mourn her sister. In the meantime, Ethan spent every spare moment with his soon-to-be family. He taught Emma to whistle and helped Lucy learn her letters. He walked the floor with Sarah when she was fussy at night, singing to her in his off-key baritone until she settled. He worked with Margaret in the garden, their hands brushing as they pulled weeds or picked tomatoes, stolen touches that meant more than whole speeches could convey. He also started making plans for their future. The house was too small for a family of 5, and he had been saving every penny he could from his wages. One Saturday, he surprised Margaret by taking her and the girls to look at a piece of land on the other side of town. A 2-acre plot with a small but sturdy house and a barn that just needed some fixing up. "Ethan, this is too expensive," Margaret protested, but her eyes were shining as she looked around the property. The owner is willing to work out a payment plan. We would have room for chickens, maybe a cow, a real garden, a proper bedroom for the girls and one for us and one for Sarah when she is bigger. He took Margaret's hand. I want to give you a home, Margaret, a real one, not just a place to survive but a place to live. Margaret looked at the house, at the land, at the mountains rising in the distance, and then at Emma and Lucy chasing each other around the yard while Sarah gurgled happily in her basket. "All right," she said finally. "Let's do it." They moved in 3 weeks before the wedding, and the whole town turned out to help. It turned out that once people saw Ethan was serious about staying, about being part of the community, they were eager to welcome him. The men helped move furniture and unload supplies while the women helped Margaret get the house in order, clucking over the children and offering advice on everything from curtain placement to the best way to preserve summer vegetables for winter. Mrs. Chen, it turned out, was a fierce proponent of the match. "That man is good," she told Margaret firmly. "You hold on to him." "I intend to," Margaret replied, and the smile on her face could have lit up the whole territory. The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon, the air crisp and clear, the aspens on the mountainside burning gold in the autumn sun. Margaret wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple but elegant, the blue fabric bringing out the color of her eyes. Emma and Lucy wore matching dresses and carried wildflowers, their faces solemn with the importance of the occasion. Sarah, now 6 months old and sitting up on her own, gurgled happily from Mrs. Chen's arms during the ceremony. Ethan stood at the front of the small church, his heart pounding, and watched Margaret walk down the aisle. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and when she took his hand, he felt complete in a way he had not known was possible. Judge Patterson performed the ceremony, his stern face softening as he pronounced them man and wife. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Pierce." Ethan did, tenderly, aware of the children watching and the whole town bearing witness. When he pulled back, Margaret was crying, but she was smiling too, and he knew those were happy tears. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you too. My husband." The word sent a thrill through him. Husband, he was somebody's husband. He was a father to 3 little girls. He had a home and a purpose, and a future that stretched out before him full of promise instead of emptiness. The reception was held in the saloon, which had been cleaned up for the occasion, and there was food and music and dancing. Ethan danced with his new wife, then with Emma and Lucy, making them giggle by spinning them around. He even danced with Mrs. Chen, who was surprisingly light on her feet and who told him that if he ever hurt Margaret, she would come after him with a cleaver. "Noted," Ethan said, grinning. As the evening wore on and the sun set behind the mountains, Ethan found himself standing outside the saloon, looking up at the stars and thinking about the journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he had been drifting aimlessly, convinced he would never have anything worth staying for. And now he had everything. Margaret came out to join him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about? How lucky I am. How I almost rode right through this town without stopping. But you did not. No, I saw you and I could not leave." He turned to face her, pulling her close. "You saved me, Margaret. You and those girls. I was lost, and you gave me a reason to be found." "We saved each other," Margaret said softly. "I was drowning, and you threw me a lifeline. You gave us hope when we had none left." They stood there holding each other as the party continued inside, and Ethan thought about that first day, about walking into that small house and seeing 3 motherless children and making the choice to sit down and not get up. It was the best decision he had ever made. The first year of marriage was not without its challenges. Money was tight, even with Ethan's wages and Margaret's sewing income. There were times when they had to choose between fixing something that broke and buying new shoes for the girls. There were nights when Sarah woke up screaming with an earache, or when Lucy had nightmares about her mother and father dying. There were moments of tension when Ethan and Margaret, still learning how to be married, snapped at each other over small things and had to figure out how to apologize and forgive. But there was also so much joy. Emma started school and came home every day bursting with new knowledge, eager to share everything she had learned. Lucy bloomed under the stability of a secure home, her natural cheerfulness returning. Sarah took her first steps on a sunny afternoon in March, toddling from Margaret to Ethan with a huge grin on her face, while both of them cheered like she had just won a race. Margaret's sewing business grew as word spread of her skill with a needle, and she began to make enough money that they could save a little each month. Ethan got promoted at the mine to a supervisor position, which meant better pay and less time underground. They bought 2 chickens, then 4, then 6. They planted a proper garden in the spring and spent summer evenings weeding and watering together while the girls played. On their first anniversary, Ethan surprised Margaret with a rocking chair he had made himself, working on it secretly in the barn during stolen moments. She cried when she saw it, running her hands over the smooth wood, and that night after the girls were asleep, she showed him exactly how much she appreciated it. "I want to give you a baby," she whispered as they lay tangled together in the darkness. "Our baby. Are you sure?" Ethan asked, knowing how hard Rebecca's death had been on her. "I am sure. I want a piece of us, Ethan. I want our child." 7 months later, in the spring of 1880, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when the doctor finally placed the squalling infant in Ethan's arms, he felt a love so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. "Hello, son," he whispered, touching the baby's impossibly small hand. "Welcome to the world." They named him Jacob, after Ethan's mother's father, and his middle name was James, for the man who had given Emma and Lucy life, and who Sarah would never remember but whose memory they kept alive through stories. Jacob was a good baby with Margaret's amber eyes and Ethan's dark hair, and his sisters doted on him from the moment they met him. "He is so little," Emma breathed, gently touching Jacob's cheek. "Was I this little once? You were," Margaret said from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "You all were. We will take good care of him," Lucy announced solemnly. "We are good big sisters," and they were. As Jacob grew, Emma and Lucy were his devoted protectors and playmates. Sarah, now 2.5, treated him like her personal doll, wanting to help with everything from feeding to diaper changes. The house was full of noise and chaos and laughter, and Ethan could not imagine anything more perfect. The years passed in a blur of moments both ordinary and extraordinary. Emma grew into a thoughtful, serious girl who loved books and wanted to be a teacher. Lucy was all energy and mischief, always getting into something, always making people laugh. Sarah was sweet and gentle, the peacemaker among her siblings. Jacob was curious about everything, constantly getting into trouble with his explorations. Margaret's dress shop became a reality in the fall of 1882, when she and Ethan pooled their savings and rented a small storefront in town. She hired 2 assistants and began to make a real name for herself, ladies coming from as far as Carson City to order dresses from her. She was proud and tired and happy, and Ethan loved watching her come into her own as a businesswoman. Ethan left the mine in 1883, taking a job as a deputy sheriff instead. It was safer work, and it paid almost as well, and it meant he could be around more to help with the children and the property. He discovered he had a knack for keeping the peace, for talking people down from fights before they started, and the town appreciated having someone steady and reliable in the role. They had 2 more children, both girls. Abigail arrived in 1883, fierce from the moment she drew breath, with Ethan's stubbornness and Margaret's determination. Rose came in 1885, the baby of the family, sweet and cuddly and spoiled rotten by everyone. The house that had seemed so spacious when they first moved in became crowded and loud, full to bursting with life and love. On a warm evening in June of 1886, Ethan sat on the porch of their home, the same porch he had helped build 8 years ago, and looked out at the life he had created. In the yard, Emma was reading to the younger children, her voice clear and steady. Margaret was tending her roses, the ones Ethan had planted for her last spring. From inside, he could hear Lucy singing as she helped with supper preparation. Margaret looked up and caught his eye, and the smile she gave him was everything. She set down her shears and walked over, settling onto the porch beside him with a contented sigh. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, the same question she had asked on their wedding night and 100 times since. "That I am the luckiest man alive," Ethan said, pulling her close. "That I am grateful every single day that I rode into this town. So am I." Margaret rested her head on his shoulder. "I cannot imagine my life without you, without all of this. You ever think about that first day, when I knocked on your door, all the time? I was so desperate, so afraid. And then there you were, this stranger offering help with nothing in return. I thought you were either a fool or an angel," she laughed softly. "I am still not sure which. Just a man who knew a good thing when he saw it." Ethan kissed the top of her head. A man who saw 3 motherless kids and their overwhelmed aunt and decided to sit down and not get up. "Best decision you ever made." "Best decision I ever made," he confirmed. Emma called out then, asking if they could have cookies before supper, and Margaret sighed and got up to deal with the request. Ethan watched her go. This woman who had changed his entire life, who had given him purpose and family, and a reason to wake up grateful every morning. He thought about his younger self, the bitter, angry boy who had buried his father and sworn never to let anyone close again. He thought about the man he had been 2 years later, drifting and lost and empty. And he thought about the man he was now, husband and father and pillar of the community, loved and needed and content. It had started with a choice, with seeing someone who needed help and deciding to stay. But it had grown into something bigger than he could have imagined, a whole life built on that foundation of simple kindness. He had walked into a house, seen 3 motherless children and a grieving woman, and sat down. He had not gotten up. And in staying, he had found everything he had been searching for without knowing it. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Ethan Pierce smiled and went inside to join his family for supper, knowing he was exactly where he belonged. The years continued to unfold with their mix of challenges and triumphs. Emma did indeed become a teacher, taking a position at the Silver Peak Schoolhouse when she was 18. She was patient and kind with her students, and Ethan often thought about how proud Rebecca would be if she could see the woman her daughter had become. Lucy surprised everyone by developing a talent for music, learning to play the piano that Margaret bought from a family moving back east, and eventually giving lessons to other children in town. Sarah remained the family's heart, the one who remembered everyone's birthday and made sure no one felt left out. And when she was 16, she began helping Margaret at the dress shop. Jacob grew into a strong, capable young man with an interest in horses that eventually led him to work at the biggest ranch in the county. Abigail was every bit as stubborn as Ethan had predicted, but she was also brilliant, reading everything she could get her hands on and asking questions that often stumped even the adults. Rose was the family favorite, though no one would admit it out loud, with her sunny disposition and ability to make anyone smile. In 1889, when Emma announced she was engaged to a young rancher named Thomas Walsh, Margaret cried for 3 days straight. "She is too young," she kept saying, even though Emma was 20 and Thomas was a good man from a good family. "She is the same age you were when we married," Ethan pointed out gently. "That was different." "How?" Margaret could not answer, and eventually she dried her tears and helped Emma plan a beautiful wedding. Ethan walked Emma down the aisle with pride bursting in his chest, and when he placed her hand in Thomas's, he whispered, "You take care of her. She is precious." "I know, sir. I will. I promise." 2 years later, Emma gave birth to Ethan and Margaret's first grandchild, a little girl named Rebecca. When Emma placed the baby in Margaret's arms, both women were crying, remembering the sister and mother they had lost. "She has Mama's eyes," Emma said softly. "She does," Margaret agreed. "She really does." Ethan watched his wife holding their granddaughter, watched her touch the baby's face with infinite gentleness, and felt grateful all over again for the path his life had taken. This child, this new Rebecca, existed because he had chosen to stay all those years ago. She was proof that one decision, one moment of compassion, could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. The other children married in time as well. Lucy wed a traveling musician who had come through Silver Peak and decided to stay. Sarah married the son of the general store owner, a quiet, thoughtful man who treated her like she was made of porcelain and gold. Jacob found his bride at a horse auction in Carson City, a rancher's daughter with an independent spirit that matched his own. Only Abigail remained unmarried, more interested in her books and her studies than in finding a husband. "I might go to college," she announced one evening at supper when she was 19. "There are schools back east that accept women now." Ethan and Margaret exchanged glances. The thought of their daughter leaving Nevada, going all the way across the country, made Ethan's chest tight. But he saw the fire in Abigail's eyes, the same determination he had seen in Margaret all those years ago, and he knew he could not hold her back. "If that is what you want, we will find a way to make it happen," he said. Abigail's face lit up. "Really? You mean it?" "Your father always means what he says," Margaret said quietly, reaching across the table to squeeze Ethan's hand. They sent Abigail east in 1893 to a women's college in Massachusetts, and the house felt emptier without her fierce presence. But she wrote faithfully every week, long letters full of her studies and her new friends and the exciting things she was learning. She came home each summer, full of grand ideas and plans, and Ethan loved listening to her talk even when he did not understand half of what she was saying. Rose was the last to leave, marrying a doctor who had recently set up practice in Silver Peak. Her wedding was in 1894, a grand affair that Margaret spent months planning, and when it was over, Ethan and Margaret found themselves alone in their house for the first time in 16 years. "It is so quiet," Margaret said that first evening, standing in the kitchen that had once been full of children's voices. "It is," Ethan agreed, then pulling her into his arms, "but we still have each other." "We do." Margaret smiled up at him, and Ethan saw in her face the same woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, with some silver in her hair now and lines around her eyes, but still beautiful, still the center of his whole world. "We always will." They settled into a new rhythm, just the two of them. Ethan continued his work as deputy, though he left most of the hard riding to younger men. Margaret ran her dress shop with Emma's help, now that Emma's children were old enough for school. They took long walks in the evenings, visited with their growing brood of grandchildren, tended their garden, and enjoyed the peace that came from a life well lived. In 1896, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Judge Patterson passed away in his sleep. His funeral was attended by half the territory, and afterward, the mayor approached Ethan with an unexpected proposal. "We want you to run for county sheriff," he said. "Patterson always said you were the best lawman he ever saw, and folks around here trust you. What do you say?" Ethan looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "I say yes. I would be honored." He won the election by a landslide and served as sheriff for the next 10 years, retiring finally in 1906 when he was 54, and decided it was time to let a younger man take over. He and Margaret spent their retirement traveling a bit, visiting their scattered children and meeting grandchildren in other towns. But they always came back to Silver Peak, to the house they had built together, to the town that had become their home. On a summer evening in 1908, 30 years after Ethan had first ridden into Silver Peak, he and Margaret sat on their porch watching the sunset. The porch had been rebuilt twice since that first sagging structure, but they still sat in the same spot, looking out at the same mountains. "Do you remember the first time we sat here?" Margaret asked. "Every detail," Ethan said. "You had Sarah in your arms, you told me about Rebecca, I told you about my father, we held hands. You said you would stay. And I did." Margaret turned to look at him, and her eyes were still that same amber color, still lit from within. "I have never regretted a single moment of our life together, Ethan Pierce. Not one. Neither have I." Ethan brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret. You and those kids. You gave me a family when I thought I would never have one. You gave me a reason to be better than I thought I could be. You gave us the same thing. You saved us, Ethan. You truly did." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to emerge. From inside the house, they could hear the old grandfather clock that had been a gift from Emma ticking steadily, marking the passage of time. But time no longer frightened Ethan the way it once had. He had lived a good life, a full life, and he was content. "Tell me again," Margaret said softly. "Tell me the story of the day we met." Ethan smiled. She asked him to tell this story at least once a year, and he never tired of it. "It was a hot July afternoon in 1878, he began, his voice taking on the rhythms of a tale told many times. "I rode into Silver Peak on a horse that could barely stand, and I saw a woman with amber eyes who looked like she was carrying the weight of the whole world on her shoulders. I heard about her sister who died, about 3 children who had nobody, about a woman trying to hold everything together all by herself. And I walked up to that little house at the edge of town, and I knocked on the door. And what did you see when I answered?" Margaret prompted, even though she knew the answer by heart. "I saw 3 motherless kids who needed someone to care. I saw a woman who was drowning and just needed someone to throw her a lifeline, so I sat down." He paused, pulling Margaret closer. "And I did not get up." "You did not get up," Margaret echoed, resting her head against his shoulder. "You stayed. You stayed with us, and you built a life, and you gave us everything." "We gave each other everything," Ethan corrected. "That is what love does. It multiplies, it grows." That one choice, that one moment of deciding to stay, it turned into 30 years of moments. It turned into a family, into grandchildren, into a whole life I never could have imagined. They sat there as night fell fully, wrapped in each other's arms and in the warmth of 3 decades of memories. Inside the house, the clock chimed 9 times, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. But Ethan and Margaret were safe and warm and together, and nothing else mattered. "I love you," Margaret whispered. "I love you too," Ethan replied. "Forever and always." The years that followed were gentle ones. Ethan and Margaret grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They watched their grandchildren grow up and welcomed great-grandchildren into the world. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and holidays. Their house always full during those occasions, loud with laughter and the chaos of a large, loving family. Emma often brought little Rebecca to visit, and Ethan loved sitting with his granddaughter and telling her stories about her namesake, about the brave woman who had fought so hard to give her daughters a good life. He told her about the day he had ridden into Silver Peak, about 3 scared little girls who had lost everything, about the choice to stay that had changed all of their lives. "So, you are my grandpa because you decided to be nice?" Rebecca asked one day when she was 8. "I am your grandpa because I fell in love with your great-aunt Margaret and chose to stay with her and her nieces," Ethan explained. "Your grandma, Emma. She is not my daughter by blood, but she is my daughter in every way that matters. I raised her. I loved her. I was there for her." "That is the best kind of father," Rebecca said solemnly, "the kind who chooses to be one." Ethan pulled her into a hug, his throat tight with emotion. "You are a wise girl, Rebecca, just like your great-grandmother." In 1918, the world was changed by war and influenza, and Silver Peak did not escape untouched. They lost good people, including Lucy's husband Samuel, to the flu. Lucy moved back home for several months while she grieved, and Ethan and Margaret held her together just as Ethan had held Margaret together 40 years before. The cycle continued, love and loss and love again, and they weathered it together as they had weathered everything else. Ethan's health began to decline in his late 60s, his years in the mine catching up with him. He developed a cough that never quite went away, and his joints ached on cold mornings. But he never complained, grateful for every day he had been given, every moment with his beloved wife and his sprawling family. On a spring morning in 1920, Ethan woke to find Margaret still asleep beside him, her breathing slow and peaceful. She was 73 now, her hair completely white, her hands gnarled with arthritis from years of sewing. But to Ethan, she was still the most beautiful woman in the world. He watched her sleep for a long moment, remembering every stage of their life together. The desperate young woman who had cried on his shoulder, the new bride radiating happiness, the mother cradling their newborn son, the businesswoman proud of her shop, the grandmother surrounded by children at Christmas. The companion of his twilight years, still making him laugh, still holding his hand, still loving him with every fiber of her being. "I see you watching me," Margaret said without opening her eyes. "Cannot help it. You are a sight worth watching." She opened her eyes and smiled at him, and he saw in that smile everything they had been to each other over 42 years. "Good morning, my love. Good morning." They rose slowly, joints protesting, and made their way to the kitchen. Ethan made coffee while Margaret started on breakfast, the two of them moving around each other with the ease of long practice. Through the window, they could see the sun rising over the mountains, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. "It is going to be a beautiful day," Margaret observed. "Every day with you is beautiful," Ethan replied, and he meant it. They ate breakfast on the porch, the same porch where they had first kissed, where they had held their babies, where they had celebrated victories and mourned losses. This porch had been witness to their entire life together, and Ethan loved it for that reason alone. "Emma is bringing the children by later," Margaret mentioned, "and Sarah said she might stop by with some of that bread she makes. We will have a full house then. Is there any other kind?" Margaret laughed, and the sound was music to Ethan's ears. The day unfolded just as Margaret had predicted, full of family and noise and love. Emma arrived with Rebecca and her younger siblings. Sarah came with fresh bread and her youngest daughter. Jacob stopped by on his way through town, his face weathered from years of ranch work, but his smile still bright. Even Lucy came, bringing her grandchildren and regaling everyone with stories from her piano students. Ethan sat in his rocking chair, the one he had made for Margaret all those years ago but which had somehow become his, and watched his family fill his house. There were 14 people here today, and more who could not make it, and every single one of them existed because he had chosen to stay 42 years ago. Every laugh, every hug, every moment of joy was a ripple from that first act of kindness. "Grandpa, tell us a story," one of the great-grandchildren begged, climbing onto his lap. "What kind of story?" "The story about when you met Grandma. Emma said it is the best love story ever." Ethan caught Margaret's eye across the room, and she smiled at him, that same smile that had captured his heart decades ago. "All right, then." It was a hot July afternoon in 1878, and I rode into Silver Peak on a horse that could barely stand. He told the story as he always did, with Margaret adding details he forgot, and the family gathered around to listen even though they had all heard it 100 times before. Because it was their story too, the foundation on which all of their lives had been built. When the family finally left as the sun was setting, Ethan and Margaret cleaned up together, washing dishes and putting things away. Then, as they had done for 42 years, they went out to the porch and sat together watching the stars emerge. "Thank you," Margaret said suddenly. "For what?" "For staying, for loving us, for giving us this beautiful life." She took his hand, her fingers threading through his the way they had that first night. "I know I have said it before, but I want to make sure you know. You are the best man I have ever known, Ethan Pierce, and I am so grateful you walked into my life." "I am the grateful one," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave me everything, Margaret, everything that matters." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable and content, and Ethan thought about the journey they had traveled together. From desperate strangers to loving partners to grandparents surrounded by family, they had built something lasting, something good. "You have any regrets?" Margaret asked. "Not a single one." Ethan brought her hand to his lips. "This life, this family, all of it has been more than I ever dreamed possible. I was lost when I found you and you gave me a home. What could I possibly regret?" "I feel the same," Margaret said softly. "Even the hard parts, the struggles and the sorrows, they were all worth it because we faced them together." As the years continued to pass, Ethan and Margaret remained devoted to each other and to the family they had built. They celebrated their golden anniversary in 1928 with all of their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered around them, a crowd so large they had to hold the party at the church. Ethan stood to give a speech, his hand shaking slightly but his voice still strong. "50 years ago, I married the love of my life," he began. "But our story started 2 years before that, when I rode into Silver Peak looking for a place to rest and found instead a reason to stay. Margaret was caring for her sister's 3 children, trying to hold everything together on her own, and I decided I would help. That decision changed everything." He looked around the room at the sea of faces, all of them family, all of them precious. "Those 3 little girls are grown women now, with children and grandchildren of their own. Emma, Lucy, Sarah, would you stand up?" The 3 women rose, all of them gray-haired now but still bearing traces of the children they had been. Emma had her mother Rebecca's gentle eyes. Lucy had her father James's quick smile. Sarah had both of their kindness written into every line of her face. "I did not give birth to these women," Ethan continued, his voice breaking slightly. But they are my daughters in every way that matters. They taught me how to be a father. They gave me a purpose when I had none. And they, along with my beautiful wife, made me the man I am today." He turned to Margaret, who was crying openly now. "Thank you, my love, for 50 years of grace and patience and unwavering devotion. Thank you for choosing me." "I would choose you again every single day," Margaret said, standing to embrace him while their family applauded and cried and celebrated the love that had sustained them all. Ethan passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1931, at the age of 79. He had been sick for several weeks, his breathing labored, his strength fading, but he held on long enough to celebrate one more Christmas with his family. On his last evening, Margaret lay beside him in the bed they had shared for over 50 years, holding his hand. "I am not afraid," Ethan whispered. "I have lived a good life, the best life." "You have," Margaret agreed, tears streaming down her face. "You have been everything to me, Ethan, everything. Take care of our family, tell them I love them. Tell them the story of how we met, so they never forget where they came from." "I will, I promise." "I love you, Margaret Jensen Pierce. From the moment I saw you until my very last breath, I have loved you." "And I have loved you," Margaret said, pressing her forehead against his. "Rest now, my darling. Rest." Ethan closed his eyes, a small smile on his face, and slipped away as peacefully as falling asleep. Margaret held him for a long time, crying softly, before finally calling for their children. The funeral was the largest Silver Peak had ever seen. It seemed like everyone in the county came to pay their respects to the man who had been deputy, sheriff, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and friend. Emma gave the eulogy, her voice strong despite her tears. "My father was not perfect," she said, "but he was good. He was the kind of man who saw someone in need and helped without being asked. He taught us to be kind, to work hard, to love deeply. He built a life from nothing, and in doing so, he gave all of us a foundation to build our own lives upon." She paused, looking at her sisters and then at Margaret, who sat in the front row surrounded by family. He walked into a small house at the edge of town and saw 3 motherless children. He sat down and he did not get up. He stayed with us, he raised us, he loved us. And we are all here today because of that one choice, that one act of compassion. He was my father in every way that mattered, and I will miss him every day for the rest of my life. Margaret lived another 6 years after Ethan's death, cared for by her children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone. She continued to tell the story of how she and Ethan met to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive through the power of their love story. On a warm June evening in 1937, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the same bed where Ethan had died. Her last words were, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." The family buried her next to Ethan under the cottonwood tree they had planted together in their yard, and on the shared headstone, they inscribed the words that had defined their life together. Ethan Pierce, 1852–1931, Margaret Jensen Pierce, 1855–1937. He stayed. She loved. They built a legacy. The house they had shared remained in the family for generations, passed down through Emma's line, and every child who grew up there was told the story of how it all began. How a cowboy rode into Silver Peak with no plan and no purpose, how he saw a woman in need, how he chose to stay. How that choice rippled outward through time, creating a family tree that spread across the West, touching countless lives. The porch was maintained lovingly, repaired when necessary but never fundamentally changed, because it was sacred ground. It was where Ethan and Margaret had fallen in love, where they had raised their children, where they had grown old together. And on summer evenings, Descendants would sit there and look up at the stars and remember the two people who had started it all with one simple choice. Because that was the truth at the heart of their story, the lesson that every generation learned and tried to pass on. One choice, one moment of compassion, one decision to stay when it would have been easier to leave, could change everything. Could create a family, a legacy, a love story that endured far beyond the lives of the people who lived it. Ethan Pierce had walked into that home and seen 3 motherless kids. He had sat down, and he had not gotten up. And in staying, he had found everything he had been searching for and created something beautiful that lasted long after he was gone. That was the power of love, the magic of choosing to care when the world would have understood if you had walked away. And that was a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth celebrating for as long as there were people who believed that one person could make a difference, that love could conquer fear, that choosing to stay was sometimes the bravest and most important decision a person could make. The end came full circle many years later when a young couple, descendants of Ethan and Margaret, sat on that same porch with their own children and told them the story of the cowboy and the motherless children, and the woman with amber eyes who had captured his heart. The children listened with wide eyes, and when the story was finished, the youngest asked, "Is it true? Did that really happen?" "Every word," the father said. "That is where we came from. That is the foundation we stand on." "Tell it again," the child begged. And so they did, the story passed down through generations like a precious heirloom, a reminder that love endures, that family matters, and that the choice to stay, to care, to commit, is the choice that changes everything. In Silver Peak, Nevada, that small town nestled in the shadow of the mountains, the legacy of Ethan and Margaret Pierce lived on. In the dress shop that still bore Margaret's name, though it was run by great-great-grandchildren now. In the stories told at family gatherings. In the values passed down through generations. In the certainty that love, real love, was worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building a life around. And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever comes after this life, Ethan and Margaret were together again, watching over the family they had created, smiling at the ripples that continued to spread from that one hot July afternoon in 1878, when a cowboy made the choice that would define not just his life, but the lives of countless others who came after. He had stayed. She had loved. Together they had built something eternal, and that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all.